Do you know that feeling when something is off, but you can't quite put your finger on it? It's as if the air around you is heavier, as if the silence has a sound of its own. That's exactly how the worst night of my life began. It was an ordinary trip, like so many others. My truck was loaded with metal crates, destination Glasgow. The A78 roads were lonely, cutting through the English countryside with a disconcerting emptiness. The kind of place where the radio loses signal and you're left with the hum of the engine and the muffled sound of tires on the wet road. That night's fog was different. It wasn't the fine mist that dissipates with the headlights. It was thick, like a wall. My fuel was dangerously low, the needle flirting with E. I decided to follow a rusty sign pointing to a petrol station a few miles ahead. The idea of being stranded on that road was worse than facing the possibility of an abandoned place. When I reached the turnoff, something immediately unsettled me. The asphalt was worn down, nearly overtaken by weeds. It was as if no one had passed this way in years, but in that situation I had no choice. I kept driving, the truck seeming slower with each passing meter until I spotted it. The petrol station, old with a 1950s design, flickering dim lights as if they were about to go out. The sign above the convenience store read, "The Raven's Rest," in faded letters. Something was not right. There were no other vehicles, not a soul in sight, but the pumps seemed functional, and that was what made me stop. A cold shiver ran down my spine when I opened the truck door. It wasn't just cold, it was a warning. Something told me to leave, but stubbornness or necessity pushed me onward. As I approached the petrol pump, the light from the small shop flickered erratically, casting distorted shadows on the cracked asphalt. There was something unsettling about this place, as if it had stopped in time. The details didn't match, a rusted soda can next to a relatively new advertisement. It was as if the station had been frozen in different decades. Outside, the wind blew gently, yet there was no sound of leaves or branches moving. The silence was absolute, except for the sound of my footsteps, echoing as if I were in an empty tunnel. That's when I noticed. Each step I took seemed louder than it should, as if there was nothing but emptiness around me. I glanced back, and the truck was there, motionless, but it felt too far away for the short distance I had walked. I scanned the petrol pumps. They were in good condition despite their antiquated appearance. The paint was peeling, but the hoses were intact and the buttons were clean. One pump appeared to be operational, the digital display flashing numbers endlessly. I reached into my pocket to grab my wallet, but hesitated. Something inside me said I shouldn't touch that equipment. Still driven by the urgency of fuel, I began filling the truck. As the liquid flowed, I noticed something in the glass of the convenience store. It was a reflection, but not mine. It looked like someone standing inside, a tall figure, motionless, just watching. I donned my mask of courage, trying to convince myself it was merely a trick of the light. But when I looked again, there was nothing there. I hurried to finish filling up and dashed into the store, hoping to find the owner or a clerk. The automatic door creaked open and I stepped inside. The smell hit me first. Dust mixed with something metallic. Inside, the shelves were partially empty, stocked with products I had never seen. I picked up a bottle of water, but when I looked at the counter, there she was, a woman, tall, slender, dressed in black, with a grey scarf over her hair. She stood with her back to me, motionless, staring into the void. I hadn't heard her enter. A chill ran down my spine, and everything within me screamed to leave. "Excuse me," my voice echoed weakly in the empty space of the store. The woman didn't move. She seemed frozen in time, like a statue. For a moment, I thought it might just be my imagination, that the flickering light or the fatigue from the journey was playing tricks on me. I decided to approach her, still holding the bottle of water. Each step towards the counter felt heavier, as if something invisible was trying to pull me back. When I was just a few meters away, I realized something was profoundly wrong. The air around her felt colder, almost freezing. That's when she slowly turned her head to look directly at me. Her eyes, they weren't human. They didn't reflect light, didn't blink. It was like staring into two black holes, absorbing everything around. My body froze. I wanted to run, to scream, but I couldn't move a muscle. She tilted her head to the side, as if studying me, and opened her mouth. No words came out, just a low sound, like the wind howling in an empty corridor. Suddenly, the lights in the store flickered violently, and a metallic clanging echoed behind me. I turned around, but there was nothing there. When I turned back to the counter, she had vanished. The water bottle slipped from my hand and rolled across the floor, the sound echoing strangely. I tried to run for the exit, but the automatic door wouldn't open. I slammed against the glass in desperation as I felt her presence again, behind me. I didn't have the courage to look. I felt a cold touch on my shoulder and instinctively screamed, spinning around to fend off whatever it was. But there was no one. The door suddenly swung open with a crack, and I bolted for my truck. The fog surrounding me felt thicker, almost solid. I jumped into the vehicle and locked the doors, trying to catch my breath. The engine took a moment to start, but when it finally roared to life, I sped off, desperate to escape. But the petrol station wouldn't disappear. No matter how far I drove, it kept reappearing like a recurring nightmare. That's when I realized I had never left the place. The road ahead looked the same, but I knew something was wrong. The trees lining the path were twisted, as if they were bending towards the asphalt, and the fog grew thicker with every mile. The fuel gauge, which should have been full, now fluctuated close to empty again. Everything around me seemed trapped in a cycle, and panic began to take hold. I glanced in the rearview mirror, and the petrol station was still there, even after several minutes of driving. It was as if the very space around me had folded. The truck started to sputter, and the engine suddenly died. I was trapped. As I tried to start the engine again, I noticed something moving on the road ahead. A vague figure was walking slowly in my direction. I switched on the high beams, and the light cut through the fog, revealing a woman. It was the same one I had seen in the shop. Now, she appeared clearer, but something was off about her silhouette. She floated slightly above the ground. The radio, which had been silent before, began to crackle, emitting a high-pitched sound that made my ears ache. A distorted voice emerged from the static, repeating something I couldn't quite make out. The sound was hypnotic, like a lament from another dimension. I covered my ears, but the voice seemed to penetrate my mind. "Why did you come back?" The voice finally became clear. It was cold, devoid of emotion, as if it came from a place beyond human comprehension. But I didn't know how to respond. I hadn't returned willingly, at least that was what I believed. The truck shook violently, as if something were trying to move it. I glanced around, and the figure of the woman was now just a few meters away, standing in the road. But what froze me in fear was the realization that there were more. Indistinct figures emerged from the fog, surrounding the truck, all motionless, with the same empty eyes as hers. My hands trembled as I tried to turn the key again. The engine roared to life with difficulty, and I accelerated towards the figure. The impact never came. She vanished into thin air, and the truck drove straight through. But the whispers on the radio continued, growing louder, almost unbearable. Something inside me whispered that this road had no end, and worse, that I was no longer in the same world as before. With every meter I traveled, the road felt increasingly unreal, as if I were plunging into a never-ending nightmare. The figures in the fog disappeared and reappeared around me, always at the same distance, as if they were watching. The radio now emitted an erratic sound, alternating between static, laments, and disjointed words. I wasn't sure how much time had passed, but my mind was starting to splinter. Then the truck stopped once more. This time it wasn't the engine, it simply wouldn't move. The wheels spun uselessly, as if I were trapped in something invisible. I looked outside, but the asphalt appeared intact. The fog around me had thickened and silence returned, laden with an unbearable weight. The truck door, which I had locked, creaked open slowly as if forced. I froze, my eyes glued to the rearview mirror. There she was again, the woman. But this time, she wasn't alone. A male figure, equally tall and shadowy, emerged beside her. Their movements were synchronized, almost mechanical, as they approached the truck. "You shouldn't have come here." The voice I had heard before on the radio now echoed clearly, but it didn't come from either of them. It was as if the very air around me was speaking. I tried to react, but my body wouldn't obey. Each muscle felt bound by invisible chains. Then, the man extended a pale, thin hand towards me, and a sharp pain shot through my head. Suddenly, images began to flood my mind, memories that weren't mine. A night, decades ago, at the same petrol station. A tragedy. I saw a family trapped in an accident nearby, but no one came to help them. The place had been abandoned, forgotten by all except these entities. They were echoes of what had happened, trapped in time, seeking something, or someone, for punishment. Why me? I just wanted to refuel. My voice finally broke free, hoarse, as tears streamed down my face. The woman tilted her head again as if deciding my fate. "You crossed the boundary, and now there's no way back." The figures moved closer, and everything around me began to unravel. The road, the truck, even the air seemed to disintegrate. The last thing I heard was a whisper, "Welcome to the end." When I opened my eyes, I was no longer in the truck. The world around me was different, or perhaps it was the same, but distorted, like a shattered reflection. The fog was still there, but it seemed alive, pulsating, swallowing everything around me. The ground felt like asphalt, but it was cold as ice beneath my feet. There was no sound of wind or life, only a low hum, like ancient machines working in silence. I looked at my hands and realized they were stained with something black and viscous. I tried to wipe them on my clothes, but the substance seemed glued to my skin, as if it were now part of me. It was then I noticed the figures in the distance. They weren't just the two I had seen before. Now there were dozens, perhaps hundreds, all watching me. Their black eyes glimmered in the fog, and their bodies, shrouded in shadows, seemed to float. I tried to walk, but every step was an immense effort. Gravity felt stronger here, as if the very ground wanted to hold me down. "Where am I?" I shouted, but my voice was swallowed by the void. The figures began to move, slowly, towards me. They didn't walk, they glided, and the buzzing around me grew louder with each passing second. Suddenly, I felt a presence behind me. Before I could turn, I heard the same cold voice that had spoken on the radio. "You are where you have always been. Here, there is no escape." The chill down my spine was unbearable. I turned slowly and saw the woman again. Her eyes, as empty as before, seemed to pierce my soul. She extended a hand towards me, and when she touched my forehead, a flood of memories surged into my mind. But they weren't mine. I saw the accident again, the desperate family, but this time I was there, watching. It was as if I were a forced spectator of that horror. The man and the woman, the entities, were there too, but in human forms, trying to save the family. It was then I understood. They weren't trapped. I was. The revelation hit me like a blow. I was trapped in this place, but why? What had I done to deserve this? The images of the accident kept coming, as if the entity were trying to show me something I refused to see. I saw the overturned truck, the flames engulfing the vehicle, the family screaming for help. But the most disturbing thing was my own silhouette, standing by the side of the road, watching. It was impossible. I had never been there. I couldn't be the man who turned his back on suffering. Yet the more I fought against the images, the clearer they became. The entities around me seemed to thrive on my confusion, their eyes fixed on me as if they were waiting for something. "You know what you did," the cold voice echoed again. There was no accusation, just a simple, immutable fact. "Everyone who passes through here has a reason. You crossed the boundary." But I didn't understand what the boundary meant. The memory wasn't mine. Or was it? As the figures drew closer, I felt something shift within me. Perhaps it was desperation or maybe acceptance, but for the first time, I stopped fighting against what was happening. I closed my eyes and let the images wash over me, every detail of the accident, every face. The man on the road was me. Many years ago, when I was still a young, selfish driver, I had passed by that accident. I didn't stop to help. I was in a hurry. It was too late when help arrived. My knees buckled and I fell to the ground. "I'm so sorry." My voice came out as a whisper. It was all I could manage to say. The figures around me paused. The woman tilted her head once more, as if analyzing my words, while the man stepped forward. "Feeling sorry isn't enough," he said. "You need to face what you left behind." And then the scene changed. The ground beneath me opened up, and I was swallowed by darkness. There was no more mist, only an absolute void. But deep down I knew this was not the end. It was merely the beginning of true penance. When I regained my senses, I was back on the road. But something was different. The fog was still there, but now it seemed more alive, almost pulsating, enveloping everything like a creature that was watching me closely. The truck was parked exactly where I had left it, but it looked older, covered in rust and dust, as if it had been abandoned for decades. I looked around, trying to orient myself, but the horizon was nothing but a grey emptiness. I walked towards the vehicle, but each step felt heavier, as if the ground wanted to swallow me whole. It was then that I realized I wasn't alone. In the distance, figures began to form in the mist. There were many, perhaps hundreds, all slowly advancing towards me. I recognized some of them, faces from memories that had been implanted in my mind. People who had passed down that road and never returned. The woman was among them, always at the forefront, her empty gaze fixed on me. But now there was something different about her, an aura of authority, as if she were the guardian of this place. Her hands were extended and the whispers began again, filling the air with words I couldn't comprehend. It felt like a sentence. Something was being decided, and I was the target. The radio in the truck, which had been silent until then, began to emit the same static as before, but with a difference. Now the words were clear. "You can escape, but only if you face what you've done." The message felt like an ultimatum. I didn't know what facing meant, but my instinct told me it was my only chance. I ran towards the truck, but the figures began to move faster. Each of my steps was accompanied by the sound of something shifting around me, as if the shadows were coming to life. When I finally reached the cabin, the door felt sealed. I banged on it desperately, while the voices grew louder, almost deafening. Finally, the door opened on its own, and I jumped inside, locking it quickly. The radio continued to repeat the same phrase like a mantra. I started the engine, and it roared back to life. But the road ahead was no longer the same. Now it was illuminated by dim lights like lanterns along a tunnel. It was a straight path with no turns. I knew I had to follow it, but what awaited me at the end was something I feared more than anything. With the engine roaring and my hands trembling on the wheel, I drove down the lit road. The lights, arranged irregularly, cast shadows that danced on the invisible walls of the mist. The path seemed to narrow with every kilometer, as if the world around me were closing in. The radio, which had once repeated the enigmatic phrase, now whispered names. I didn't recognize them, but I knew they belonged to the people who had been forgotten on that road. Then she appeared again, the woman, but this time she stood in the middle of the road, motionless, looking directly at me. Her silhouette was more defined, and her eyes, once empty, now shone with a dark light. I tried to swerve the truck, but the steering wheel wouldn't respond. It was as if an invisible force compelled me to move forward. Just as the truck was about to hit her, everything stopped. The engine turned off, the lights went out, and darkness enveloped me. The silence was deafening. I could feel my heart racing, sweat trickling down my face. Then a voice echoed in my mind, not the cold, distant one from before, but something deeper, more personal. "You need to remember, this is your judgment. I was yanked from the cabin by an invisible force and thrown onto the road. When I stood up, I realized I was no longer alone. The figures that had been chasing me now formed a circle around me. Each one bore the face of someone I hadn't helped, someone I had ignored, someone who had suffered because of my indifference. The woman stepped forward. "You have seen what you did, but now you must feel." She extended her hand, and before I could react, a shock coursed through my body. Suddenly I was in their place. I saw the road through their eyes, felt the pain they felt, heard their cries for help as the world abandoned them. It was unbearable. Each moment of suffering felt like an eternity. When I finally returned to myself, I was on my knees, crying, begging for forgiveness. "I'm so sorry," I shouted. "Please let me go." The woman approached, kneeling before me. Her eyes were no longer empty. They now reflected something I couldn't understand. It's not about letting go. It's about accepting. Before I could ask what that meant, the ground beneath me began to crack. The light from the road extinguished, and I fell into the void. The last thing I saw was the figures disappearing into the mist as the woman's voice echoed through the darkness. When I opened my eyes again, I was back on the road, but everything seemed different. The fog had disappeared, the sky was clear, and the oppressive silence had given way to the sound of birds in the distance. I looked at the truck parked in front of me. It appeared intact, without the signs of rust or wear I had witnessed before. I stood up with difficulty, my muscles heavy as if I had carried the weight of 1,000 lives. The memories of that night were still vivid, every face, every scream echoing in my mind. I walked towards the truck, and before entering, I noticed something strange on the windshield. It was a note. The words, written in uneven handwriting, seemed to have been hastily scrawled. "Forgiveness begins with you. Don't wait for the road to take you back. Create your own path." I looked around, trying to find any sign of who might have left the note, but there was no one, just the empty road stretching out before me. I sat in the cab, started the engine, and it roared to life with the same familiar sound as always. But something inside me had changed. As I drove, I noticed that the road seemed more alive than before. The trees appeared greener, the air fresher, as if that place had been somehow purified. Yet the sense of relief was replaced by an unsettling emptiness. I knew I had been spared, but I also understood that experience would never leave me. In the distance, I saw a sign pointing to a small town. It wasn't my original destination, but I decided to head that way. Perhaps it was time to finally stop, to break the cycle that had trapped me for so long. As the truck picked up speed, I glanced in the rearview mirror one last time, and there, in the mist that now seemed like a distant memory, stood her silhouette, the woman watching by the side of the road as I drove away. Months later, I still remember that night as if it were yesterday. I haven't told anyone what happened. After all, who would believe me? But something shifted within me since then. My journeys, which were once merely a means of livelihood, now carried a different purpose. Whenever I see someone on the road in need of help, I stop. It doesn't matter the hour, the place, or the risk. The memory of those faces in the fog, the muffled screams echoing in my mind, won't let me ignore them. I know I can't change the past, but I can prevent others from experiencing what I witnessed. There are nights when I wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of the crackling radio still vibrating in my ears. On those nights, I wonder if I'll ever truly escape that road, that woman. Was it a warning, or merely the beginning of something much larger? Today, as I pass through a small village, I see a poster stuck to a post. It shows the face of a missing man, a truck driver like me. They say he was last seen on the A78, driving alone on the same road that changed my life. I look up at the grey sky and wonder, did he find what I found? Or worse, did he not get the chance to return? As I drive again, I glance in the rearview mirror once more. The road behind me is empty, but I know the fog in some way is still there. Always waiting, always watching, and now the question remains. What would you do if you were in my place? Would you have the courage to face what lurks in the shadows, or would you surrender to fear? The road is always there, waiting for those who dare to cross its boundaries. If this story moved you, share it with someone who also loves a good mystery. Leave your comment. Do you believe there are places in the world that hold secrets beyond our understanding? I'm curious to know what you think. Don't forget to like and subscribe to the channel for more dark tales like this one. See you on the next journey, if you have the courage to continue.